Okay, I know we're supposed to be on slide 13, a couple slides ahead of this, but I wanted to start here just to remind you of where we were. So if you'll recall, we're looking at what Darwin came up with and wrote about, and what he came up with was natural selection, genetic variation, overproduction of offspring, struggle for existence, differential survival, and reproduction. So we're kind of running through these to give you a good understanding of each one. And likewise, here we were looking at genetic variation. And the bottom line, most important thing to remember about genetic variation, it comes from mutation, but it is the raw material of natural selection and evolution. Remember that, and I'll be reminding you of that for the rest of the year probably. Here we're looking at the overproduction of offspring. And that is another crucial part of how natural selection works. Starts with genetic variation, but then the fact that all species produce more offspring than can possibly survive is almost as important as variation in giving natural selection something to select from. So if we take the frog here, for example, all these frog eggs, there may be hundreds of frog eggs here, and one mother frog is going to lay a lot of eggs. But not all of those eggs are going to develop and hatch. And of the ones that do develop and hatch, not all the tadpoles are going to develop into little baby frog, fully developed frogs and grow to adulthood. Some of them are going to be eaten. Some of them are going to die from disease. And of those that do develop and survive to adulthood, all of them are not going to survive and reproduce. And again, the important thing is reproduction. Survival, you want to survive long enough to be able to reproduce. But if you don't survive long enough to be able to reproduce, then you haven't passed on your genes to the next generation. Therefore, you haven't contributed to the evolution of the next generation. So, overproduction of offspring is a huge component of natural selection, the mechanism of natural selection. There are a couple terms here that you need to be aware of. For those that do survive and reproduce, we refer to them as being selected for. So in terms of natural selection and evolution, those that survive and reproduce are selected for by natural selection. And those that don't survive and reproduce are, as we say, selected against. So selected for versus selected against. And where Darwin got this idea is from Thomas Malthus, the economist that was worried about human population growth and how we, as humans, would run out of some resource at some point if our population continued to grow. And that's still true today. Overproduction of offspring is a problem if there is some limited resource. And again, that idea comes from Malthus. So what this leads to is competition. Overproduction of offspring leads to what Darwin referred to as the struggle for existence, which is competition. Competition between individuals for what would be a limiting factor. Whatever's running out would be the limiting factor, and we call it a limiting factor because it limits the population size. So individuals may be forced to compete with individuals of their own population. So like in this example of the meerkats, they live in troops. So each troop is a population, and the individuals of that troop are competing against each other. They're cooperating with each other, but they're also competing against each other. They're also competing against other populations. So, for example, there may be another troop over the hill, and this troop is competing with that other troop. And so there's all kinds of competition going on there, and there can be competition between individuals of other species. So the meerkats here are eating some of the same things as other species that live around, that live in their territory or live within their habitat, and they're competing with those other species for those food sources. Just like overproduction of offspring leads to competition or the struggle for existence, overproduction of offspring and the struggle for existence lead to differential survival and reproduction. And the individuals that survive, and here's some more terminology that's used in when talking about natural selection and evolution. They are referred to as having the highest fitness. Darwin came up with this concept of fitness. And you can think of fitness as being how well an organism or a species fits in its niche. So this goes back to the concept of niche. And remember, a niche is like the job, the job of a species in its habitat. So all the things that go into that individual or that species surviving and reproducing in its habitat, that is its niche. And the ones that are best able to do that, survive and reproduce in their habitat, have the highest fitness in that habitat or in that niche. And it has to do with how many offspring each individual produces. So an individual that produces the greatest number of offspring has a fitness of 1. And that's as high as the fitness can get, 1. And you can think of that as like 100%. An individual that produces no offspring has a fitness of 0 or 0%. And then there's everybody in between, right? So that's how fitness works. So evolutionary fitness refers to the relative ability for individuals of a population or species to survive and reproduce. The relative ability. So that's that kind of that scale from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. So this leads to adaptation. And what we're looking at in this example is an extreme adaptation. I just wanted to, there are many examples of extreme adaptations. And what you see here is a bird that's perched on a branch in the dark. It's nighttime. And the bird's asleep. And I don't know if you can make it out or not, but there's a moth sitting on top of the bird's head. So this is not part of the bird. This is a moth that's sitting on the bird's head. And if you look very closely, you can see a black line here that is the proboscis of the moth. In other words, it's the mouth part of the moth that it uses for feeding that is going to the bird's eye. And what it's doing is drinking the tears of the bird from the bird's eye. And in the tears, and just like your tears, there are proteins dissolved and other nutrients dissolved, and the moth is getting the moisture from the bird's eye and also some of those nutrients from the bird's eye. So this moth has adapted to get its nutrients and moisture from sleeping birds' eyes. What we're seeing in this inset is what the tip of that proboscis looks like. It's a hook with hooks, so that when it hooks into the corner or the edge or the lid of the bird's eye, it will stay there, and it will be able to then get what it needs from the bird's eye. So it's just an extreme example of adaptation, but that adaptation is the result of natural selection. And it has led to that moth being a better fit in its habitat, in its niche. It's better able to survive and reproduce. So here's that explanation. The cartoon, it kind of goes along with, if you watch the Learning About Evolution video, in that video there's an example that one of the scientists gives, that if you're in the woods and you're walking along in the woods along with another person and you come upon a bear and the bear chases you, you don't have to be faster than the bear, you just have to be faster than the other person, because the bear will get them and you'll get away. Same thing going on in this cartoon. There's a cat coming, to eat these birds, and one bird is so stupid that when it hears the bell of the cat, it doesn't fly away. That bird is going to be selected against, and the birds that are smart enough to fly away are selected for. They're going to survive and reproduce. So the cartoon represents that stupid birds are less fit. So that brings us to the end of how natural selection works and how Darwin laid out the process of natural selection. It starts with genetic variation, then overproduction of offspring, which leads to competition, or the struggle for existence, as he put it, which leads to differential survival and reproduction. Here we're going to compare Darwin's idea of natural selection with Lamarck's idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics, if you'll recall. And Darwin didn't use the term evolution. He used the term descent with modification. That's what he wrote about, which is the same thing as evolution. So if you'll recall, Lamarck's hypothesis, inheritance of acquired characteristics, would explain the giraffe's long neck as the giraffe reaching and stretching its neck over its lifetime. One individual giraffe would stretch and reach for leaves on higher and higher branches during its lifetime, and therefore its neck would grow during its lifetime, and then it would pass that long neck on to its offspring. That's Lamarck's idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. That's generally wrong, and so what we're looking at here is Darwin's explanation. So the giraffe population had variation in neck length. Remember, it starts with variation. So in this image, we're seeing in the giraffe population, there's variation in neck length. Now, it probably is, well, it isn't this extreme. Just a couple, centimeters or even millimeters in difference in neck length can be the raw material for selecting in giraffe populations. So there's variation in neck length. Individuals with longer necks were better able to feed and therefore survive and reproduce. In other words, they're more fit. In giraffe populations, having a longer neck gives you a better chance to survive and reproduce. That means you're more fit. You have a higher fitness, right? These individuals were selected for and passed their long neck genes to their offspring. So their offspring are more likely to have long necks also. Those with shorter necks are less fit, they're less able to survive and reproduce offspring, and they're selected against. And I just want to remind you that the units that change, the smallest unit that can change evolutionarily are populations and species, not individuals. Individuals don't evolve. Here I just wanted to get across to you that along with a longer neck come a lot of other adaptations or a lot of other physiological changes to support having such a long neck. You may have heard that when giraffes put their head down to drink, they run the risk of their brain exploding from the blood pressure of all the blood being pulled by gravity to their brain. If you've ever stood on your head, you've felt the same thing, or been upside down, you've felt the same thing, and you can actually die because of that pressure. But giraffes have physiological mechanisms in their circulatory system to prevent that kind of pressure being delivered to their brain when they put their head down. So I just wanted to make you aware of that because it's just an interesting point that, along with a longer neck, a lot of other adaptations have to come along with it. But the bottom line is that the desirable traits, in other words, adaptations, increase in the population. As a result of natural selection, adaptations increase in the population. And in the case of giraffes, an adaptation is having a longer neck to be able to gather more food. Helps you survive and reproduce, be more fit. So in The Origin of Species, Darwin also wrote about unity and diversity, which is, if you'll recall, a big idea in biology. So Darwin was really the first to propose this big idea in biology, the fact that life is related to each other. So phylogeny refers to the study of evolutionary relationships or evolutionary relationships. Phylogenetics, or a phylogeneticist would be a scientist that is studying evolutionary relationships between species or groups of species. This phylogenetic tree is a diagram that shows how species are related to each other. So this diagram, this phylogenetic tree, is supposed to represent all life on Earth. Now, there's no way that you could generate a phylogenetic tree that includes all life. For one thing, we don't even know every species that's on this planet. We still have yet to find millions of species. So that makes it impossible, but also it would take a huge tree to represent every single living species on the planet. But it's still meant to represent all the groups, right? The major groups of life on this planet. And there are so many different kinds of species because there are so many different ways to make a living on this planet. In other words, there are so many niches. So the reason there are billions of species on the Earth is because there are billions of niches. There are billions of ways to make a living, to stay alive and reproduce. If you saw the original Jurassic Park movie, Jeff Goldblum's character said that life will find a way. And that's the idea, that if there's a way to make a living on this planet, life will find a way to make a living that way. And that explains the vast diversity of life on Earth. So the general trend from bottom to top is branching. In other words, divergence. The branching that's going on as we go from lower on the tree to higher on the tree is known as divergence, where species diverge from each other to produce new species. Notice too, though, that if you go backwards, the branches follow back down to a common trunk or a common branch. So, for example, where branches come together, that represents common ancestry. And the closer the branches are between two groups of species or species, that means that they are more closely related to each other. So you're probably not familiar with urochordates. You will be when we study the phylum Chordata, that both vertebrates and urochordates are members of. But the fact that vertebrates here, the dog, is representing our own branch, so we are here with the dog within the vertebrates, and we are closely related to these animals known as urochordates. We're more distantly related to echinoderms, right? Because the branches are farther apart. So that's the idea of how the branches come together. But notice that they are all coming together as we go down in the tree. They're all coming together to one common trunk. And that represents the last universal common ancestor. In other words, the fact that all life, when life arose on the planet, it started with the first living things and has diverged from those first living things that came about 4.5 billion years ago, and has been diverging ever since, and producing all the species that we now have on the planet. So this idea of a common trunk, this is the same thing that I was just explaining. The more closely the species are related, the closer the branches are to each other. All the species currently living evolved from once living species. 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. So even though there are billions of species on the Earth right now, they represent only 1%, probably less than 1% of all species that have ever lived on this planet. So species have come and gone. Most species are extinct. All life is related by common ancestry, and that's what we refer to as LUCA, which stands for the last universal common ancestor. LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. So that's it for what Darwin was thinking about, what he was writing about, at least, as briefly as I could possibly present it. What we're going to be looking at next is the modern evidence for evolution. How do we know species evolve? And there's a lot of evidence that Darwin could not have observed. It's, for example, the genetic evidence that we've discovered, Darwin had no clue about. So we're just going to get started looking at this modern evidence with this slide, and then the next video is going to present each of the 5 different pieces of evidence individually. But life's been evolving for at least 3.5 billion years, probably 4 billion years. There's molecular evidence, molecular fossils in the form of molecules and microfossils, in other words, fossilized bacteria that you can only see under a microscope. The molecular fossils have to be discovered. They're just molecules that are trapped in rocks that may have been created by living things. And so these are the oldest pieces of evidence that we have that of when life arose on the planet. But there are 5 pieces of evidence that we use today to show that life has changed over time. And remember, that's all that evolution states. Evolution is simply the idea, biological evolution is simply the idea that life has changed over time. Species have changed over time. So fossils are probably the number one and clearest representation that life has changed over time. Biogeography refers to how life has moved around the planet over time. So where, for example, we can apply that to humans. Humans, it appears that humans, the first modern humans, arose in Africa and then migrated out from Africa. And the fossil evidence shows us very clearly how they migrated. Our ancestors migrated out from Africa to eventually inhabit the entire Earth. But biogeography has to do with where species are found on the planet through time. Homologous structure. The idea, for example, and you've seen this image before, that all us tetrapods, in other words, all us land-dwelling, four-legged or four-limbed animals have the same bones and the same general arrangement. That's homologous structure, and that comes from common ancestry. But it's evidence of evolution. It's evidence of common ancestry. And that brings up a point I really want to stress here. Evidence of evolution is evidence of common ancestry. If there is evidence of common ancestry, that is evidence of evolution. Embryonic development. Again, evidence of common ancestry. Very early embryos of much different animals look very similar to each other. And that is evidence that they are closely related to each other. So again, we're going to be looking at separate slides for each one of these things, so we'll get into more detail about that when we get to that slide. And then finally, there's the molecular sequence comparison. We can compare the molecular sequences between the DNA of different species to show how closely related we are. Also, the molecular sequences of proteins between different species. But again, we'll get to that when we get to that slide. We'll look at that in greater detail. We'll look at all of these things in greater detail on upcoming slides.